Like, get away from that grill. You don't know how to start no fire. You know how to start no fire. Put this fire out. This ain't no fire, goddammit. Eddie.
One of my goals for this year was to integrate lighting of some description into my modelling. We all have to start somewhere, so I'll take you through the steps I took to create a scene for my gun truck and integrate some effect lighting into this setting. So let's dial it up on this hillbilly theme, hey? I seem to keep finding my way back to these circular bases. They help cut down on dead space and fit perfectly in the display cabinet. So the hot wire foam cutter was again called upon, and I cut myself a circular base from 50mm thick XPS foam, and I could start setting the scene. I have a few elements I'm looking to integrate to help sell the look of an Iraqi road in the middle of nowhere, but I'll talk into those a little bit later. I start the process by mapping out the balance of the scene. The basic road with a slight curve would house the truck, and either side being the sandy fall off with a few key elements. The fall off was carved away with a blade and a chisel to add some dynamic in the levels, and a small pothole and some cracks in the soon-to-be road were added by carving them into the foam. For the theme of this scene, I really wanted to double down on that hillbilly idea and thought a fun element to include might be a barbecue on the side of the road. I'd been experimenting with LED lighting from a pack from Light My Bricks, and I did a short video on how easy that was to use, so I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't seen that one. But this was finally my chance to integrate some lighting into one of my projects. I doubled down even further with this theme and thought an old oil drum would make for the perfect improvised barbecue. That drum comes from a mini art set of modern oil drums, and a small hole was drilled in the base, and with the LEDs in place, I can't tell you how excited to see those lights flickering in the drum was. Simple things, I know. I was encouraged by this experiment, so I reamed a hole on the underside of that foam to house all the components. It was ugly but functional, kind of like my airbrushing, and all of the components could be housed in that cavity. The road surface was created by covering the foam in an AK Terrains paste asphalt. You may have seen me use this paste plenty of times in other videos, and it's essentially the same, but it's got a little bit of a finer texture and obviously the different colour. Using a spatula, I'm able to ice the road like a cake. By keeping the surface wet, I'm able to smooth out that surface with a soft brush and remove some of the lines created by the spatula. This is a water-based product and does tend to dry out, so mixing the paste and keeping it regularly wet can help extend its life when you're putting it away on the shelf. After leaving it overnight to dry, I noticed the product had developed some fine hairline cracks, and I suspect that might have been due to me overloading it with water, or possibly a hot day here in Australia made it dry too fast. Either way, it was actually a happy mistake because the cracks in the road looked fantastic, so the modelling gods were smiling on me today. I could now feed the wiring for those LEDs through the base and start applying this sandy desert terrains paste. This is done in the same fashion as the asphalt, however, this can be a lot less structured and irregular simply because it is a natural undulating terrain. The wires could be fed through the base of the oil drum, and then the drum is then sat in place. This will allow it to be settled into the terrain rather than sitting on top of it. The downside of this is the placement needs to be perfect because once that paste dries, it will dry like concrete. VMS produce various pots of diorama textures for the lazy modeler, and I'm proud to say I'm one of those. Having these various graded natural stony textures is just so easy to call on and sprinkle over that wet paste. Adding these different grades of pebbles and sand will add variation in that finish, and the wet paste will help hold them all in place. I'm also able to add tufts of dried grass into that wet paste to add an organic volume to the scene. Another great way to create that realistic organic look is to find a root ball in the garden and pick away at some of the finer roots and integrate them into the groundwork. Super easy and surprisingly authentic. Once the paste had dried, it was then about integrating those sandy, dirty tones. I begin with evening out the foundations with Tamiya flat earth. Now this is covering the majority of the surface area, but being sparingly applied and randomly over the road surface. I can then go back with a dark yellow and focus on any raised surfaces over that terrain. And I'm not entirely covering the flat earth, but this dark yellow does have a significant coverage, leaving only the deepest dips in that terrain as that darker colour. Then back over the surfaces, only this time with a buff colour, and over a smaller surface area again. I'm focusing on the highest points and adding variation over the groundwork. And misting coats of this buff over the road and terrain will add a filter and help integrate and soften the overall look of the groundwork. And it might be a little predictable, and I'm sure you guys have seen me using this dressing before. And there are so many online design tools at our disposal now that designing a base like this is accessible to most people. Canva seems to be the go-to for a lot of people, although I have access to the Adobe suite, so I tend to take the more traditional design path with designing these bases. This sheet is a thin styrene with a 3M mounting film on the rear. The graphic face is a printed self-adhesive vinyl simply stuck over the styrene. Now you'll find that most sign shops or office works and things like that would offer a service supplying you the prints on vinyl if you're wanting to try this for yourself. You can then just roll it around the foam evenly and carefully, and that mounting film will hold it all in place, and then the excess can be trimmed to follow the shape of the terrain using a sharp blade. Any gaps in that terrain and that display shroud can be filled with the terrains paste, and again I'm adding the texturing, and then I'll be painting it to integrate it all in, just like I did with the previous steps. When filling the gaps of that asphalt, I noticed the diluted black paste was making some really interesting staining and variation in the road surface, so I just went with it. So no doubt you've been seeing the rails and barricades in my mock-ups, so let's talk about those. That concrete wall barricade is from a Meng set of precast concrete walls, which are absolutely stunning and look amazing under paint. But it was looking kind of cramped as it didn't have the height it needed to sit above the lines of the truck, so I'm going to have to save that for another project. The guardrail is from another Meng set, and it's pretty basic and had a number of ejector pin marks that needed to be addressed, but recognisable modern elements like this guardrail give the viewer a frame of reference and are a great thing to sneak into your dioramas for that reason. The guard was sprayed in a Tamiya aluminium direct from the rattle can, and then to create a galvanised look to the finish, a darker aluminium colour was stippled over that part using a sponge. It was a slightly darker tone, and it was surprisingly effective. I needed some height to scale this scene properly, so I picked myself up a set of Q8 traffic signs from MiniArt. Poles for the legs seemed nowhere near tall enough, at least not for this scene, so I substituted the plastic parts for some square section brass rod. The sign was painted in the same manner as the guardrail, and the decal was applied over the face. Geographically incorrect for this scene, but it had the vibe, and that was all that mattered.
Just the vibe of the thing. It's all part of it.
And a great way to add visual fatigue to just about anything is through a post-shading technique. A heavily thin mix of AK Real Colour Smoke and Tamiya Red Brown are applied through the recesses, around the details, and generally just around the edges of the sign. And you can see that grime building up and giving it that almost burnt or scorched look to the graphic. The key is keeping the paint heavily thinned, as this will keep it translucent and work with the layers that are sitting below it. I also used these techniques on another sign from that MiniArt set to add yet another element to this scene. They could then be sat in place with white glue, as super glue can sometimes react with that XPS foam, and whilst the risk is low, it's the last thing you need at this stage. Yes, another armour modeler complaining about his figure painting, but it really isn't my strong point, but it is something that I enjoy, but I have to be in the mood for it. For me, figure painting is all about making a start and letting momentum carry me through the process. This figure is from Def Model and gave me that casual, laid-back nature I wanted to add to the scene. Adding a figure to the setting is also a terrific way to create a sense of scale and again give the viewer a frame of reference. The figure was primed in a red oxide primer in the hope that that might introduce a degree of warmth to the paintwork, although I think this may have been a bit of a futile exercise. I'm painting this guy using acrylics and a wet palette to keep the paints wet. This should allow me to keep the transition smooth as I move through the dark to lighter tones. For each colour, I generally work on around 3 to 4 tones for those sections. There is a mid-tone and of course the shaded tones and then the highlights. Generally speaking, each layer of the colour holds around 3 passes of that paint to build up the opacity. Once the base colours are set, I then build up the chocolate chip camouflage pattern using a mahogany brown to create a disruptive pattern, and then the dots of black grey are applied, and then another pass over those same shapes but using a slight offset and silver grey. If I'd used white, it had the potential to be too stark, whereas the silver grey seems to be a better fit for this scale. Once dry, a selective wash with oils is applied and the figure could then be matte varnished to seal everything in place. The predominant wash is shadow brown, however I did incorporate some flesh shadow to better define some of those flesh tones, and I was surprisingly content with the result. Time to start gluing everything in place and I make my final test fits. That additional height of that signpost gave that back of the scene the crescendo and scale it demanded, and as much as I love that little barricade, I think the sign was a far better idea. Dried pigments I'd used on the truck build can now be selectively stippled over the groundwork. I don't want to overload this because it'll dominate that paintwork that I've already applied. These pigments will not only add the colour to help tie the truck and base together, but it'll also add a level of texture to the groundwork. Because of the textures in the base, that dry pigment will tend to grab and want to hold in place, but the effects in the earth areas are further enhanced with selective washes of earth and dust deposits. The wash will run and settle around the textures in those elements and give those areas some definition, but they will also be a binding agent for that pigment. I was conscious to be selective here because overloading it would drag the colour of that earth tone down, which is something I was trying to avoid. Home stretch now, and a couple of 3D printed chairs and milk crates would help sell that look of a backyard cookout, as would a couple of cans of beer from the AK set of bottles and cans. A small piece of brass wire and a couple of sausages sculpted with green stuff putty over the grill, and this hillbilly shindig is about to get started. I know a couple of orange LEDs in an oil drum might be considered a small step in the scheme of things, but for me it was a bit of a giant leap forward and has given me the confidence to try something else. As mentioned, I'd been wanting to add lighting to my builds, so as far as I was concerned, this is one of my 2025 goals achieved. I've spruiked the fact before that there is no doubting a landscape base can elevate your model to another level. It gives the viewer instant context and scale and something to better help them understand the subject. Adding the small but dynamic lighting setup will add that extra layer of interest and help bring that static scene to life through colour and movement. If you wanted to light your own models, I'd encourage you to have a go. It's a fun and easy thing to do, and it exposed me to another part of the hobby I was unfamiliar with. As mentioned, I used Light My Bricks sets for this project, but there are plenty of other companies offering lighting kits for LEGO, and that has simplified the whole process for us as scale modelers. In exciting news, I'm pleased to announce the first Workbench Hobbies group build. Over on the Patreon page, my killer kangaroos are about to start building the Tacom SD KFZ 250 half track. I'll be providing cheat sheets and additional content to help them with their builds. So if that's something that you'd like to get involved with, then be sure to head over to the Patreon page, because I guarantee you it will help fast track your modeling journey. Next build up, I'll be showing you one of the absolute best value model kits I've seen in a long time, and I'll be sharing with you some ideas on how to improve it on a budget, and I can't wait to bring that to you. But for now, remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
Now that's a fire.